Hey everyone, welcome to Impossible Trade-Offs. I am your host, Katie Harbath. Today we are bringing you a conversation with Professor Kate Dommett. She is a professor of digital politics at the University of Sheffield, and her research focuses on digital campaigning, elections, and the role of data in democracies. Her and two of her colleagues, Glenn Cufford and Simon Krzyzewski, have put out a book called Data-Driven Campaigning and Political Parties, where they look across 5 democracies and talk to 18 different political parties about how they use digital in their campaigning. They went into this trying to understand what threat is it actually to democracy? How much is it actually being used? It's basically a kind of an empirical look at are all the fears that everybody talks about. Cambridge Analytica is the thing that always comes up. Is that actually happening? And they find out it is not. And so the book really goes, I so appreciate the nuance that they go into in this book, not only across the different countries and political parties, but really understanding how campaigns are actually using data. And I think that this is a really important conversation as we continue to think about this conversation about the AI and the impacts of AI on campaigns and elections. And so I hope you enjoy. Great. All right, Kate Dommett, thank you so much for joining Impossible Trade-Offs.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you because you have written about something that was the start of my career around working in campaigns, doing data-driven politics and all of that. But I want to start by just having folks, having you introduce yourself and a little bit about the work that you do and the research that you focus on.
Yeah, so I'm Professor of Digital Politics, which is a kind of title that allows me to explore anything digital really within the realm of interest. But I think primarily I'm kind of interested in election campaigns and how digital tech is affecting elections. So that's kind of in the back office stuff, which is why I'm interested in data. So how campaign organizations are adapting and moving from kind of older techniques to more modern techniques, how they're being balanced. But then also the kind of content side. So what's actually happening online and how do we feel about it as a public? And therefore, how might that be regulated? So essentially, I'm a bit of an academic magpie. I like kind of looking at lots of different aspects, but that's broadly the two main themes.
And so I mentioned your book, Data-Driven Campaigning and Political Parties. I'll put it here because we do the video too. What made you want to write this book, and how did you want to, what were the questions that you're hoping to answer as you went into it?
Yeah, so the book is like we kind of say it's quite unashamedly descriptive because I think we were all really motivated by the fact that the three of us, so myself and Simon Krzyzewski and Glenn Cufford wrote this book. And we were all studying political parties and how they were using, how they were organizing and how they were using digital. And the kind of prevailing narrative at the time we designed the project just really wasn't matching up with what we were experienced to seeing on the ground. So we had this kind of real narrative around political parties, particularly like having these vast troves of data with like hundreds of thousands of points of data on each individual. And how that was kind of being used to build up really deep profiles of us and then micro-target us online. And our kind of experience was like, yeah, parties have data, but their systems are really clunky. They crash all the time. It's really hard to link these data points. And so we just didn't really kind of feel that the prevailing narrative was matching our expectations. So the book was kind of motivated by the questions of like, what is this thing called data-driven campaigning? How is that practice varying internationally and especially outside the US? And then why are we seeing varied practices to try and help us understand a bit more about what we might want to do in this space?
And where do you think, because I want to dig into what you all found, but you know, if I had a nickel every time somebody brought up Cambridge Analytica, I'd be a very rich woman right now, around that. And I'm curious if you looked into it all or thought about how do these narratives get so pervasive, even though the research might not be there to back them up?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it is one I've thought about a lot. I don't think I've got a great answer. But it really kind of struck me. I was doing some work in the House of Lords, trying to advise them on thinking about digital tech and its impact. And one of the very first meetings, one of the peers kind of said, oh, I've watched The Great Hack. It's awful, isn't it? Like, we really need to regulate this. And it was just such a compelling story, I think. And there's something about like every new digital technology, we're seeing it now with AI. It's so easy to be attracted to that worst case scenario because the kind of change is so rapid, I think, and trying to orientate and be able to evaluate effectively what is going on and what are the likely impacts. We seem to just get drawn to that worst case scenario. I don't know if that says something about kind of our psychology, but it does seem to be really pervasive that we find those narratives really, really compelling, and it takes quite a lot of evidence to push back and go, actually, maybe this isn't quite what's going on.
I think too that it's people just have a hard time getting their heads wrapped around very complicated issues. And so it's easier for them to think in terms of black and white, winners and losers, good guys, bad guys, all of that. And then you add the elements of a Hollywood, right? Of cinematic and other things like that too, that it can be, it's just the easier thing to fall into. And I think too, when people are trying to find explanations for things that are maybe a little unexplainable or they
Mm.
don't know, it's something for them to be attracted to as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good take. And as an academic, you're always trying to tell an overly complicated story. So it's like, yeah, they do have data, but it's probably not as pervasive or extensive as you think, and it probably doesn't have the impact you think it does either. That's not a compelling story.
Now, another thing before we go into the details is you also did this across 5 different countries. Is that right? And the number 18 sticking in my head. I can't remember. Was it 18 political parties?
Yeah, that is right. Yeah.
I was rereading the book last night to to refresh my memory. Why was that important to you, and how did you pick the countries?
Yeah. So it was important to us. So essentially, we kind of conducted over 300 interviews. So those are in 4 of the countries. So we had the US as the reference case, essentially. So the US is so dominant in our understanding of campaigning. And it is where a lot of innovation happens. So I think it's rightly the focus of a lot of attention. But we were most interested in looking outside the US. So we picked 4 countries that we kind of thought were the most likely to be adopting the practices in the US. Kind of saying, if we don't find what we were seeing in the US in these contexts, then I think that raises questions about the whole narrative. So we looked at Australia, Canada, the UK, and Germany. And what we did kind of find was a lot of variation like between those cases. But I think one of the most interesting things for me was the difference between like major and minor parties, and like huge inequalities in what's happening like within parties in the same national system. And even reading over to the kind of US case, if you look beyond those presidential campaigns, like what's kind of happening further down the chain was really incredibly different to what we were seeing in those national contexts.
Yeah, I always tell people the US is the exception versus the rule in terms of how elections are run, but it has such a big global impact
Yeah.
there's a lagging impact, in fact, and I've been thinking a lot that right now with all the AI stuff that is happening, and I keep saying that I think this year is a bit more of what social media was to elections in 2008, and then when we'll have the next US presidential in 27, 28, and then you'll have the next global elections in 29, so it'll be really interesting to see. I'm taking a longer arc view of this, but um so then you did a lot of your research through doing interviews. Who were the type of people that you were trying to interview?
Yeah, so we were largely trying to speak to the kind of heads of digital, heads of data, campaign management. So the kind of apex of the campaign organization, and that's what we kind of aim for consistently across the countries. But we also took the decision because that's actually quite a small number of individuals, really, when you then like look under the bonnet of parties. So we also added a kind of number of other categories. So we spoke to a lot of campaign consultants or like firms who were offering specific digital or data like practices for parties. And then we also kind of went down the party structure a little bit. So I was doing the interviews in the UK and Canada primarily. So I was speaking to people who were kind of running, regional or even sometimes like kind of constituency level within the UK campaigns, just to sense check like how far down the hierarchy this stuff was actually going. And I think that's kind of one of the bits of the book that I'm proudest of, is it moves beyond a focus of those people who are at the center of a party and who are like specially hired to deal with data and analytics, to actually understand like how do the range of people within a political party deal with data. And I think we were able to kind of really show differences between parties in how like some activists were much more skilled in using data, more familiar with it than in other parties where it was just like a professional elite.
So what were some of the ways that you were finding that campaigns were using data?
So we had this kind of question, which was like, what's the single most important piece of data that you use in
And
your
how do you define data, right? Like, I mean, you
well,
do
that's a
that in the
great
book too,
question.
right? Like,
Yeah, so one of the things, like a lot of the book is really trying to unpack a lot of the language here, because like what is data? That's, what does that actually look like on the ground? And what is analytics? Because that can be a whole range of different processes. So a lot of what we do is kind of go, right, what are the types of data that we see? And we kind of try and classify different forms of data. So like publicly available data, like kind of census data, or data given from the state, like the electoral roll, kind of disclosed data where like a campaign will go and gather that data and use that. So we kind of try and set out what all these things are. And that really helps us then map how consistent the data is in one country to another. So like before we started the research for this book, I kind of assumed that every country had an electoral roll that was provided by the government. And it's
no,
like, oh no, this is like a
no, no,
really
no, no.
UK American thing. It's not done in Europe commonly at all. And I think so we were able to go, right, well, state data, one, isn't available everywhere, but also it massively varies country by country, and even in the US, state by state. So we're able to kind of pin down, what are the specific data points, and then ask people, well, which of those is kind of most important and how are you using it? And so like routinely, it was the most important piece of data was like, is someone registered to vote? And then in systems where there were kind of majoritarian electoral systems, it was where they registered to vote. And then do they turn out to vote? And so much activity was just understanding who isn't on the register. Do we need to turn them out or not turn them out? And like, where should we be focusing our resource and attention? Much less on the kind of persuasion, which I think mirrors like broader insights that are now emerging from different approaches. But yeah, it was relatively basic, but the dynamics did vary dependent on the electoral system. So Australia, you don't need to turn people out. Compulsory voting really changes the game. So I think things that as soon as you think of them, you're like, oh, well, of course that would affect how data is used. But it was only when we were comparing side by side, I think those differences became quite stark.
Yeah, another one that you definitely point out as well that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about, especially if they're coming at it from the American context, is the fact that many of the countries that you also focused on are in parliamentary systems, where your focus is more on the party versus the campaign. And so that had a big difference too.
Yeah, definitely, because it totally changes the infrastructure that you've got available, and the wider organization. So like in the UK, for example, we've got some political parties that have like incredibly large infrastructure, and they've got long-standing histories, like long-standing technologies. Others are kind of much newer and don't have that infrastructure. But the party as an object therefore affects the way that you're approaching data, the way you're analyzing it, because there's this kind of legacy in a way that presidential systems, they do have that long-standing data that passes from campaign to campaign, but it's much more focused on the individual. And so there's possibilities to kind of bring in new approaches to data in a way that it's much harder for a like long established party in a parliamentary system to do so.
Did you see any differences across uh between different parties? Because I think one thing that I wanted to ask you about too is that you had challenges, it looked like particularly from folks on the right to even talk to you about this. And so I'm wondering if you A saw differences, and then B, how you also navigated when trying to think about having, a solid methodology in doing this research when there's a mix of people who are willing to even talk to you.
Yeah, I think, well, to take that second question first, I think this is something we really agonized over because I think, using interviews as a method anyway and talking to campaign professionals like has its drawbacks because you kind of, you're talking to people who are selling a story, but particularly not being able to get equal access to all political parties across the spectrum was really difficult for us. And we did find that, right-wing parties were just less willing to speak to us on the record. And we kind of got around it in a number of ways. So we spoke to a lot of the like the consultants who were working with those parties about the work they were doing. And we did manage to get some interviews with people after they'd left the organization. They felt more open. But compared to parties in other perspectives, it was much more challenging to be able to research them. So we did kind of other things so we basically had to draw on other sources to try and build up a picture of what was going on. So kind of a lot more documentary analysis, a lot more kind of like looking at the actual practice of campaigning, and doing a lot more kind of like remote observation, I suppose, of actually what was going on. But it is a real challenge, and it's one that we couldn't find a satisfactory answer to, really. So we kind of acknowledge it quite upfront in the book about, there is this real challenge about what is going on within these parties. We're confident we know as much as we could have done under the circumstances, but I still have questions. And like subsequently, I've been doing research, looking at using data access requests, for example, to be able to actually like request the data that right-wing parties hold on individuals, just to try and get that bit more insight. But it was a kind of can of worms we didn't want to open for all 18 parties across the country for the book. We already had way too much data to report for that. So yeah, it's a real challenge. But in terms of the differences, I think so. One of the ways I tried to generate insight within the UK, and the real difficulty is not all the same information was available in each of the countries, but just to kind of contextualize. So we've got really great financial disclosure in the UK, so you can look at exactly where money was spent by political parties after an election campaign. So we analysed the spending returns of all political parties in the UK to look at like what they were spending on data and infrastructure and testing and things like that. And you can kind of see that, different across the spectrum, parties are investing to really different degrees in data, and they're investing, like some of them a lot in social media, other much more in kind of internal data systems and operations. So different parties seem to be putting their money in different places, which I think is quite interesting as like a research agenda going forward to understand that more.
Can we dig into really quickly the different types of data that you were looking at? Because I think that's important to kind of pull back the curtain, because we hear all this data, we want data, data, data. And then I keep joking. I'm like, do you just expect the data fairy to come out and tell you all the insights that
Yeah.
come from this? Like there's a whole other aspect to it of actually having to and analyze it. But I'm looking at, if you got your book out, we're going to page 47 in our hymnal today. Um, that I was looking at, of just the different types of data that you all found.
Yeah. So we have 4 categories. So publicly available information. So this is what I was saying earlier, like the kind of census, the voter file, disclosed information. So this is what we term kind of information that people willingly give campaigns. So it could be, you give away you say how you're planning to vote, or like you take part in a poll, for example, and you give away information voluntarily. Then there's kind of inferred data. So this is where the model data kind of comes in. So like prediction scores, or like likely turnout, I suppose. And then the 4th category is monitoring data. So this can be quite mundane. So it can be like, how many doors have you knocked on in a particular district? but it can also be like the tracking pixels that are now used by parties to gather data about browsing behavior. So we kind of separate those out and then talk about the specific sources of like where that information comes from, and then what that actually looks like. So like, where do you get information about your age, like gender? That can be directly disclosed or it can be inferred. And I think understanding where that data comes from is really important because it raises questions about like data quality. So if you have information about someone's gender from like a state record, you're likely to think it is more reliable than gender as inferred by a model of other data. And that's really, really important for thinking about which data is actually used in decisions. Because I think, as we were kind of talking about before, like data is really amorphous to understand and conceptualize. But I think what we're trying to show is political parties have access to a lot of different data. A lot of that is duplicated. It's not altogether clear if you're a decision maker within a campaign and you've got access to, significant amounts of like specific data points, like which data do you use to make a decision? You've got so much to go on. I think that's really not well understood because it's quite hard for us as academics to observe how decision making occurs.
And also, not all of that data can be, frankly, even acquired in some of these countries, right? Because you talk about Germany a lot, and this was always my favorite thing when the Germans would come over, even when I was working at the NRSC and other places, and they're like, "Tell us all of your ways," and we tell them the ways, and then they're like, "Oh, we can't. Oh no, we can't. We can't. You can do that?" Like, that's the, like, and I'm like, I don't know what to tell you, right? Like, and so, yeah, walk us through that, how you kind of, like, discovered that of, like, the differences by it was kind of both regional, it seemed like, and country specific.
Yeah, it's really, really different in different places. So one of the things we try and do when we're trying to like explain the differences is think about why. And it's often a product of the kind of the regulatory environment in which a political party finds itself, but also the kind of broader electoral system or party system, or even kind of just like the media that is available. It's not common across all countries. So for example, like political advertising, like we didn't look at France within this book, but we know that that's banned in the run up to elections. So it's just
Not
not.
just the run up, it's like 3
Yeah,
months, 6
yeah,
it's
yeah,
the longest blackout period that I
yeah,
know of any country, yeah.
yeah. So there's kind of whole questions about like what media are even on the table, um, and then there's a series of regulations around like what you can actually do. So in some ways, it was interesting studying the 5 countries because Australia and the US were quite similar in a lot of ways because their privacy law is practically non-existent. So it's much easier for political parties in those countries to be able to kind of buy data from external providers. But in the European context, it's really constrained in terms of what you can buy and the conditions under which that data has to be gathered because of GDPR. But then even if you compare Germany and the UK, in the UK, there is a democratic engagement provision within data protection law, which allows political parties to be able to gather and process data in a more extensive way than it's possible to do in Germany, where there isn't that exemption from GDPR. So in Germany, you have to get like direct consent for recording data. And a lot of the state data that is available isn't automatically passed to political parties. It's only available if they make a specific request for certain data sets. And then it's passed to them, not at the individual voter level, but at a kind of broader group level. So you can't do that kind of individual data matching that it's possible to do in the UK, where you get an individual voter on the voter file and then their history of did they turn out to vote. So the kind of regulatory contexts in which each party finds itself massively affects the way that it can use and store data.
Well, and that's what I really liked about the book as well, because a secondary thing that you are arguing, in addition to sort of like looking at the like what is digital data driven campaigning, and we're going to talk about its overall threat to democracy and stuff, but also looking at the regulatory environment of this and how, without having this clear understanding, the regulatory interventions, as you say, will either tackle the wrong problem or tackle the right problem, but in ways that do not produce the desired result. Can you dig into that a little bit more, both in terms of why you wanted to also focus on the regulatory environment and if there's any examples of sort of that wrong way or the right way?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think I'm always really keen to think about the real world implications of a lot of what we like, are studying within academic context. So I was particularly keen to think about regulation. And at the time we were doing this research, the Digital Services Act was kind of going through its drafting. And there were a lot of calls for political advertising and particularly targeting on political advertising to be completely banned. And you can kind of understand the rationale for that, which is that this is being used in really, really problematic ways, and so we should just get rid of it. But it kind of felt to me like a bit of a blunt object for it. Ignores the potential for actually data-driven campaigning to be positive and to result in positive outcomes. So all we kind of were interested in doing in the book is like looking at what is going on in order to be able to kind of facilitate a debate about, well, what is and isn't problematic. It's something we don't actually get into in a huge amount of detail. But I think, there are certain instances where it's kind of like, you can kind of think that there are instances where individual level data could be used to drive mobilization. And we actually do see that as the most kind of common practice by political parties across the country. So in that situation, if you move towards a ban, you get rid of all of that potential advantage of mobilizing individuals, which just feels like it's solving the wrong problem. So then the question is, so like, when is targeting okay and when is it not okay? And how do we then think about removing those instances that are not deemed okay? So one of the things that we did for the book that again didn't end up, but is now going to come out in another article, is we did a bit of research about public attitudes towards different types of data use. And we were surveying people across the 5 countries about, which pieces of data were they actually okay with being used for political targeting. And there was really interesting variation in what people were happy with. So the US are far more permissive in a range of kind of different data being used for targeting. Whereas we also included the Netherlands as well. They were very, very anti a lot of their data being used. But there was a kind of consistency with like people were fine with age and with political views, really uncomfortable with ethnicity, sexual orientation, relationship status. And I think when we start kind of looking at that, the nuance of what people feel okay with, you can start then going, well, maybe we should be looking towards restricting that type of targeting for political purposes unless it's used for mobilization. And so I think it starts allowing you to kind of go, what is exactly wrong? And therefore, how might regulation limit those problematic practices as opposed to just completely curtailing everything? So hopefully it gets a little bit more nuanced.
I also want to go into a bit about well, actually, let me do this first. So, how are these campaigns using this targeting data? Because you mentioned political advertising, and I think that's the first thing that everyone's minds go to, but it's actually used for far more than
Yeah.
just that.
Yeah, so depending on on the electoral system and the kind of incentives they're working under, a lot of it is about identifying like target areas. So, which seat gets the investment, which campaigns to back and push resource into. It's especially the case outside the US because money is just such an issue that they really have to focus resource. So a lot of it is kind of, firstly, where do you focus? And then in terms of the kind of targeting, it's thinking about, it kind of combines with testing a little bit, then think about how do you develop an effective message for that particular group and ensuring that the message for the particular focus of your attention isn't alienating like other voters. So there's a lot of thinking about how people respond to data and how that intersects with the focus of your attention. But then like we also kind of see just same like message targeting, but on different media. So I think we often talk about like Facebook targeting, but in particular, or on other platforms, as something really novel. But in a number of the countries, like direct mail is a very established tool. Like that's targeting. That you can quite often see campaigns, send addressed letters to specific voters on specific issues that they're known to care about. And one of the things I'm interested in is like, why is that okay, but doing it online isn't okay?
And where's the transparency in direct mail? Like, I don't see anybody asking them to scan in and like provide. Yes, that's a big rant of mine for
Yeah, no, I
sure.
totally agree. I think it's not a question that's thought about enough. And I think there's a danger that when we think about regulation, like especially around digital, we do it as if offline campaigning isn't a thing. And there are practices that we think are completely okay. And so I think what we consistently need to do is go like, why is digital different? Like there
Well, and
are
even
certain attributes, but
Well, and even door-to-door campaigning. So I remind people micro-targeting in the United States was first started in the early 2000s. It was before the online presence, and they were using commercial data to do not only what you're saying with direct mail, but to everyone's greatest fear online is that these campaigns are going and sending a specific message to this specific person online. You want to know another way that that happens? Door knocking
yeah.
and going and knocking on doors and having somebody from the campaign say that. And so I think that's a really good point, but I want to ask you that, okay, if it can happen on door knocking, is that happening online? Like that's everyone's greatest fear that that's happening. Did you see that level of detail happening in these campaigns?
Yeah, so it's really nice. So we've now kind of got the complement study to what we did. So we did all these interviews, and again and again and again, we were being told by people you wouldn't expect to. They were kind of going, you know what? It's not that sophisticated. We don't do micro targeting. It's really kind of broad groups. And they'd explain it by going, it's just like too risky. Like as political parties, it's like there's too much at risk if you are seen to over target. And there were a number of examples. The one that sticks in my head is a political party had put out a letter on cancer treatment to women in a specific area, and it blew up in the local media because one of the respondents thought that they'd got their NHS data. And so they were like, how did you get my health records? This is awful. And it caused the party to just completely back off doing that kind of quite targeted messaging. So we were being told we're not really doing it. But then there's a really lovely study that came out like 2 weeks ago, led by Fabio Botta in Amsterdam, that has used the meta targeting data set and has shown that across elections internationally over the last few years, like most campaigns use one targeting criteria in their advert, and that where we do see campaigns using more, so like 4 or more, it's in the US and interestingly in France, I think. So US, Canada, and France are doing more fine-grained targeting, but still it's not extensive. Like the vast norm in most countries is like a focus on age or geography.
I'm gonna have you send me that study so that we
Yeah,
can link to it in the show notes
it's brilliant.
for sure. So this takes us to the big question. Does all this what threat does this all pose to democracy?
I think that is an absolute great question. So I have to be careful here because I'm often accused of being like too optimistic. So for me, it's
Don't
all
worry, everybody on this podcast knows that my mantra is to panic responsibly, and we're all about the nuance here. So, listeners, give her the grace to have
yeah,
nuance here.
thank you. So I essentially think we need to kind of take a breath and really take the moment to get the diagnosis right. I don't think that, like, firstly, I don't think data driven campaigning is new. And so I don't think it's a kind of new and radical threat to politics. This is something that's been going on for ages, and we've all been quite happy with this happening for a long time. I think what then is interesting is like how how digital is kind of disrupting those existing accountability systems and the ways that we've traditionally developed systems of oversight to be able to just kind of sense check what's going on. And I think there are a couple of interesting examples that kind of are useful for illustrating how there might be changes going on here. So one of the most interesting things that we found in the interviews in Germany, for example, so like heavily regulated space, where there's a lot of really effective oversight of what goes on. And we found that campaigns in Germany were really relying on like Meta's targeting parameters, because it meant that they didn't have to hold the individual level data themselves, but they could log on and access individual level data that was being provided through the Meta archive. So it was providing a loophole that was challenging the prevailing democratic norms of that particular country. And I think that example shows you that, you know, there are instances in which like digital tech in particular can facilitate new forms of data-driven campaigning that are counter to the democratic practice in a specific location. So that example shows for me data is going to affect democracy in different ways in different countries, dependent on the prevailing democratic norms of that system. In some places, it's not actually that disruptive. It's very in line with things that have been happening for a long time. But in a few instances, there are these circumstances where it kind of allows something that is new and that is quite counter existing precedents in that space.
Well, and you brought up a good point that I meant to touch on is the role of the online platforms in all of this, because you said a lot of campaigns, especially when you go more down ballot, don't necessarily have the resources to build these big databases and stuff like that. And so a lot of them do end up using the targeting tools of these online platforms, which also I think brings another facet to the problem that you're looking at.
Yeah, and I think I don't necessarily think it's a problem. I think for me, digital media is like another tool to a campaign's bow. And I think platforms do definitely have responsibilities. But I like, once again, it's more complicated like that. You know, it's campaigners are choosing to use these platforms. And sometimes I do think that we let campaigners off the hook a little bit too early and point to the problems with platforms and enabling behavior. You have to choose to use a platform. And we've got examples in the book of like, especially Green parties who seem particularly conscientious, who, you know, choose not to use certain platforms or certain targeting parameters because it's not in line with their goals. So absolutely, I do think the platforms like especially should be kind of enabling study from researchers. The old kind of data access drum will happily beat that. But I think, you know, we shouldn't just be focusing on them as the ones to fix this challenge.
I think too, and by the way, I did not promise to pay her at all to say that stuff. I feel like I've been saying that stuff for so long. Of like they choose to use the platform, I didn't make them. But I think you talk about the regulatory aspect of this too, and like people's thinking about regulating targeting and all that. But then you're seeing the platforms. Some of them are just making the decision not to allow political advertising
Yeah.
because of that same type of pressure. And I oftentimes remind them too of thinking about there are unintended consequences that can come from that, where there's going to be organizations who want to do mobilization efforts and stuff like that that just aren't going to be able to if you're not allowing this type of content on your platform.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. And I think like another unintended consequence of all this is like a lot of what we don't talk around data is like the inequalities between access for different campaigners. Now, if a platform makes a change, on one hand, it's like great, they're kind of updating their policy or, bringing in tighter restrictions, but it's much easier for a larger and well-resourced campaign to be able to adapt and develop new strategies and, have new staff come up with an alternative approach than it is for a very small, under-resourced organization. And I think we also need to kind of think about that. It's like the equality of access to these things, but also the capacity of campaigns to constantly be having to react and respond to what has been just frankly like so many changes from platforms over the last couple of years that have huge consequences for how they construct their strategies. And I think we should probably be talking about that. It's like in kind of calling for this constant change. Are we actually embedding inequalities between campaigns that have the capacity or not to respond?
And one thing that you do mention in here that I think is important to touch on of a potential risk is data security that
Yeah.
we don't think a lot. Like these campaigns have so much data on us, and people will oftentimes go to platforms and be like, I need to know all the data you have on me. But we have no regulation of me being able to go to a political party and being like, please tell me all the data you have on me.
Yeah, it's really challenging. And I think like Glenn was particularly interested in the data security aspect. Because if you look at most campaign organizations outside the US or outside the US, like not in an election year, and within the US, sorry, um, like the people who are running these campaign, like the data infrastructure behind the scenes, it's like tiny, tiny numbers. So within the smaller parties, there will be like one head of digital who does all of the digital and all of the data management. And that job portfolio is just ridiculously huge if they're also responsible for ensuring like security. And so, we did trace like a number of data security threats and like intentional hacks on party databases that had occurred in the different countries. And I think, it's why it commonly occurs, but I think it's likely to happen more often. Even in the UK, we've recently seen a cyber attack on the Electoral Commission that access the data that they hold on voters. So I think it's a real point of vulnerability, and it doesn't feel in the moment like a lot of political parties internationally have the kind of internal knowledge to be able to counter that.
So, last question or last thing I want to touch on is I have to imagine one of the challenging things about being an academic researcher in this technological space is how fast things are changing. Not only what the platforms are doing, but now you've got AI on top of it. What did you either not only through writing this book, but in your own work, how do you try to approach that, especially when you're probably getting calls all the time of like, give us analysis on the impact, like what's going to happen in this. And it's like, well, I'll let you know in 3 years when my study comes out, right? Around it. So how do you balance that and think about that?
Yeah, it is an ongoing challenge and something that really is, I find it's wonderful because it means there's constantly something new to discover. But it's really, really frustrating because I think the attention cycle of like academia as opposed to the rest of the world is just on completely different timescales. And my good colleague Amy Auburn's written this great article about like the cycle of technology panics, which she kind of says, new technology comes along, we all get really concerned about it and worry about its impact. We commission a whole bunch of research about it to try and understand it more. And then by the time the research comes back, attention's moved on to the next technology.
I mean, we still haven't gotten the Facebook 2020 research yet. And it sounds like we're probably not going to get some of that till after 2024. It's
we're
like,
working, I promise.
I know. It is not a slight. It is not a slight. I have many friends who are working on it. It's a reality of the timelines that
No, it really is. And the way that kind of academic research works isn't fit for quick solutions. So I kind of think that there's two things that we can do as academics, because I think the thing that we need to avoid is kind of falling into that speculation. And we saw it a lot in the kind of wake of Cambridge Analytica. There were so many articles which are like, we're being manipulated, like democracy is at threat. And it's taken such a long time to like roll that back with empirical evidence that I think we need to kind of not jump in and do the speculation, because I think that will happen elsewhere. So I think there's two things we can do. I think like first is kind of like a look to recent history and lessons of previous technologies, because we've seen this again and again. And so I think people kind of, when they're asking me about AI, I talk to them about microtargeting. I was like, this is what we were saying about microtargeting and how sophisticated it is. And this is now the evidence of A, what's happening, and B, what we know about its effects. And from that, let's like, forecast forward about what that's likely to mean in terms of this new technology. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I think we can do is just like be much more overt in like advocating for and thinking about like theory within academia. This is how we kind of generate and test all of our hypotheses. But there's certain things that we know that have consistently been shown to be found with previous technologies. So we're thinking about AI again. One of the recurring studies that's come out of how people consume information online is that there's a huge partisan bias in how we kind of consume and are convinced by information. And we're likely to see that again around the consumption of AI. So I think it's thinking not about us as kind of almost empty vessels as humans who can just be bowled over by a new technology, but actually think about what we know about the way that humans process information from a variety of sources, and therefore forecast forward again to generate expectations around the latest technology. Because often what we find is the same patterns that we found in the past. So I think that's the kind of responsible approach to just trying to reset the debate. But it is challenging because everyone wants a juicy quote about how at the moment AI is going to dominate elections next time around.
I know. And I love how you talked about that in terms of cycles, because it's something I've just been noticing more and more and more, not just in technology, but in history. Like, there's a lot to be learned from the past
Yeah,
of what this can all look like. And I think the responsibility we all have of, again, you know, being rightfully worried and wanting to think about like the potential impacts of these types of anything that's happening, technology, et cetera, but also really separating out the signal from the noise of what's
yeah.
actually happening versus not. So, Kate, I'm so grateful. This was a fantastic conversation. I could talk to you for hours on this, but I really appreciate you joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.